James, what are your thoughts in how are you going to manage to serve the Lord in these last days? How are you going to apply that?
Just one moment at a time.
One moment at a time.
I have a number of competing thoughts in my head right now. So let me just start doing a data dump and we'll see where we wind up.
Okay. Do we need to get write it down on the data too?
No, I'm not going to say anything that important.
Oh,
If this is me we're talking about.
it's like good stuff.
So doctrine itself, my own definition of it is that which we believe, live, and teach. Not necessarily in that order, but all three of those things are different from each other, and yet they should piggyback on one another. But there are people who profess to believe in the omnipotence of God and live like practical atheists, and or deists at least, at best. That God pulled the ripcord and now he's standing back to see how it works out. And yet they'll claim that God superintends everything. It's just not in their own lives. And yet that's what they live out. And so that is part of their doctrine, whether it's something they admit to themselves or not. Doctrine is something, and Gene and I were talking about this definition earlier, and he noted too that, and he's the one who brought it to my attention, that there are some sentences that seem to contradict with each other. And I think it's because doctrine can be something, well, doctrine is something each of us has personally. We have our own personal doctrine, our own personal theology. This is what I believe about God. This is what I believe, teach, and live. This is where the rubber hits the road in my life. And then there are corporate doctrines that various old dead guys got together and sat down with the scriptures and said, the scriptures say this, and they say this, and they say this. How do we reconcile them? And somebody else says, well, if you glue these two verses together, then it means this. And they hashed it out, and they came up with words and phrases, creeds, like you mentioned, that encapsulate the fuller teaching of Scripture, so that we can say the Trinity and not have to go to every verse where one of the persons of the Godhead is mentioned and then stick them all together every time we want to talk about God. And so there are those. And so a lot of times doctrines are the thumbnail. They're the key that lets us in the door of the greater wisdom that's behind it. Yep. Like the Westminster Confession, or the Shorter Catechism, which has so much depth to it, and is still deeper than most of us grapple with. And yet those are doctrinal things that a lot of us claim to hold to. There's also the thing, if you go to a church's website, you'll find that they've cut and pasted, the Baptist Confession from 1847 to their website and say, this is what we believe and teach. And if you listen to their sermons in the first 5 minutes, that's not a thing of what they believe and teach. Because if so, the pastor would have his head on a pike out front by that point. And so they paste up something because you got to have something or you don't look like a real church. But there has to be a place where that teaching intersects with the life, and then the life with how it is actually lived out, how it's professed, how it's lived. So back to your question, I hope to continue trying to call myself to account for this and the way it affects this.
Well, why is that so important to doctrine?
Because that's where it comes from.
That's where it comes from.